time right now.
It's your time.
You gotta have a dream.
This is your dream.
And make it work. Oh, it is your dream.
This is your dream.
Make it work.
Make it work.
It's right in your heart. It is the dream.
This is your dream.
Make it work.
Make it work.
Tonight on Felicia.
We're having problems with African Americans.
What kind of problems are you having with African Americans? I want to take this up because you mentioned, you said earlier that somehow we shouldn't be involved in the political life of South Africa.
The tension that exists between African South Africans and African Americans is to do with the fact that they each have something that the other one wants very badly.
The people who played a key role in turning around these things are the children of Soweto and Katlego who died, who made it happen ungovernable.
And now for your host, Felicia Mabuza-Suttle.
In celebration of Human Rights Day, we want to look at the role African Americans played in the struggle and their role in the new South Africa. Reverend Leon Sullivan in the 1970s played an important role in gathering support for the anti-apartheid measures. He introduced the Sullivan Principles, which were a guideline to American companies operating in South Africa. In 1997, Reverend Sullivan encouraged United States companies to withdraw their business interests from South Africa. We recently talked to him. Reverend Sullivan, thanks for consenting to talk to us. The name Leon Sullivan literally equals eradication of apartheid. Take us back to the 70s, the Sullivan Principles, and what you did for this country.
During that time, my focus was on the United States. It was the late 60s. But then I went on the board of General Motors. I was the first black to go on that board, and I guess one of the first blacks in the world to hold that kind of position in corporation. And I ran into South Africa because we were the largest employer, General Motors, in South Africa. And I came to see for myself what was going on here, and I decided that something had to be done to eradicate that. That as a black man, we could not permit apartheid to remain in the world. I couldn't do it. So I went back and said to General Motors, either we're going to work to end this thing, or else I'm going to leave General Motors. Now I'll do some other things. So out of it came the Sullivan Principles, where I required companies from the United States to follow equal rights principles, justice, to end discrimination, and I strengthened them step by step. For the first part, I opened cafeterias and restrooms and that kind of thing. Many people said it wasn't too important, and I knew what I was doing though. And then I got the companies to work to end other amenities, the beaches and the theaters, and discrimination in the hospitals. And then I took another step, which was a giant step, to get the companies of America and the world to confront the government to end the apartheid system. And I had held meetings all over the world that very few people knew about to get the companies of America and the world to confront the government to end apartheid. And I said to these companies in America, either you're going to end it, I'm going to call every one of you out of here. And then I issued a 2-year deadline in 1986 and said to the South African government, either in 2 years apartheid is ended, Nelson Mandela is freed, and blacks have the right to vote, or else I'm going to call for a total worldwide embargo against you, call every American company out, General Motors and everyone, until it happens. I imagine mile for mile there are more companies in South Africa than any other place in the world. So I realized I could use the leverage of the companies and let money talk to end the system.
African American ties are very strong with South Africa. Thinking of the 70s as I was there, the marches against sanctions against South Africa. Explain why.
In the civil rights movement, when I worked with Dr. King, we called my boycotts, and I created the boycott movement in doing this in America, selective patronage. It was rather sanctions against companies to require them to do things to employ people equally. It's using money, letting money do your talking for you. Now, I marched, of course, and I carried the placards. You had to do all that. But the economic force is what I needed, because I knew that money talks. And I used companies as a battering ram against the walls of apartheid until they came down.
Thousands of African Americans have supported black South Africans as they fought against apartheid. The anti-apartheid marches in Washington and many other American cities brought the apartheid injustices to the attention of the American people. Milad, let's talk about those years, the 70s, and later on we're going to talk about today. The role African Americans played. I mean, I know you wrote 2 books about Steve Biko.
It was a role, I think, that came naturally to most African Americans. A role in great part that grew out of the experience we had encountered in the States. I remember when I was first introduced to South Africa, it was in the 60s. And I had just gone to university, Howard University at the time. And I was given a book called House of Bondage, which was produced by a black South African photojournalist by the name of Ernest Cole. And I've never learned whatever happened to Ernest Cole, but that book probably had more of an impact on me than almost anything I'd read both before and since. Because at that time, and until that time, I had believed the struggle that we as African Americans were encountering was a private struggle, a struggle that only embraced us as African Americans. And suddenly, through this book, I was introduced to a struggle of a whole race of people in another part of the world. And the similarities were so eerie that it became so much a part of what we were experiencing in the States, as well as what was happening in South Africa, that those of us who went through this struggle began to see the universality of the entire issue of both racism and human rights, and the need to play a role in eradicating that wherever it took place. So it was only natural that African Americans would understand in some small way the struggles that black South Africans were experiencing here, because they were in so many ways similar to what we went through. I don't want to make the mistake of saying the similarities were exactly alike, because they're not. Major differences. But the notion that people had been oppressed and suppressed because of their color, and that people had major contributions to play that were not being, to contribute, that were not being recognized, I think is what drove both the struggle in the United States as well as here.
Vuyo, would you say the struggle was the same, and having stayed and studied in the United States that long, did you find yourself assimilating into the American system and feeling the same pain the same way?
Felicia, there's no doubt that there's a natural affinity with the struggle in America when I went there. There was a natural coming together. Coming from South Africa, I was coming from a place that embraced America. America's imperialism had affected South Africa, and to a large part the whole world. So there was an understanding. Black Americans, in the way they dressed, etc., revered also. So there was also a comfort that I had when I went to the United States. And it was easier, certainly, to understand struggle. They embraced me, African Americans.
And you married an African American woman, in essence.
Absolutely.
And in fact, you married a South African woman.
Absolutely.
Charles, you say people like Randall Robinson, and as you said, Reverend Sullivan and others, brought this to the fore. Could you explain that a little bit more?
I think that the sanctions movement was one of the most effective movements of our time, and very little has been said about it, but billions, trillions of dollars, as Reverend Sullivan said, was turned away from South Africa. And that didn't even happen in the civil rights movement. So it was very, very effective and sophisticated strategy. And it was one that a lot of people who could buy into, who might not necessarily be on the front lines. In terms of
I detected an impatience or a lack of understanding from South Africans when I read your article about the role that the African Americans played.
Yeah, we're hearing many. I don't speak for the whole African American community. It's far too diverse. But I think that most of the people that I know that are here, and some of them here in this audience, are people who are really dedicated and really about doing what they do for a living, but also who see this experience, being here and now, as a cause. And they love this country, they love the people, and they're willing to stay and struggle. And I think that's the important thing. And you know something else, Felicia, it's very important. Never before in our history, except for maybe the founding of Liberia and Sierra Leone, have so many African Americans left home to come to a single place in Africa to try to throw down roots and make a life. I think that's very significant, and it should not be taken for granted. Doesn't mean that we're perfect people.
That's why, in fact, I'm going to get Professor Makhoba in, because you're responding to Professor Makhoba's article. After the break, we'll hear from him.
Freedom is not free. That you do, in fact, have to pay for it. Someone pays for that freedom.
If you've donated or received an organ, please call us urgently.
Well, Professor Makhoba, during the break they said, what was the article that Charles was responding to? You wrote the article. Tell us, what did you say? Maybe just some key points in the article.
One of the issues that I raised strongly was that it seems like affirmative action was becoming a new form of really producing unequal powers, because it was really driven by the very same people whom it threatens. And it was problematic to have the people driving it that it threatens, especially from the white communities. But I also made a point that we have lots of African brothers and sisters from the continent of Africa and sometimes from the American continent who I think get used by the system in order to give figures that suggest that actually there is affirmative action. Most people from the African continent or from the American and the British islands come here, they are black, they are given very important positions and in senior managerial positions, and to the outsider and to the less educated and unsuspecting, they constitute what the white community would like to say, this is a process where we are affirming blacks, whilst actually what they are doing is they are giving opportunities, obviously, to qualified people, but those people do not have a stake in this country. They don't have stakeholders that support them, and they cannot fight the political battles of South Africa. They can assist, I think, their brothers, but certainly I can't see that an African American or a British Afro-Caribbean or a Nigerian or a Ghanaian can come and fight the battle at the political level in this country on my behalf. And in fact, in America, there is a glass ceiling, I think, that applies to foreign people, where you cannot occupy positions that are politically important in the development of the American political system. And that's the point that I was trying to make, that I welcome them here. They have lots to contribute. I appreciate what they have done, but they must realize that there is a limit to where they can go. And the limit of the battle in South Africa today is political, and at that level, they have really almost their obstruction rather than a facilitator of the process. Because, you know, when you come, you are given sort of a permit for 1 year. You are
in America, you mean?
No, here.
Okay.
You are given a permit for 1 year by the bosses or the masters. They're going to renew it next year. They have problems with this transformation. What are they going to do to you? They are not going to allow you to actually exercise any political right in the institutions where you are employed. They are going to expect you to be a person who just signs letters and almost like a messenger boy, but you are very glorified and you enjoy status. But you will not be able to carry the political process of transformation if you are a foreigner in this country at that level. That was my point.
Teresa, are African Americans taking jobs from South Africans?
I would like to think
or is
not.
the perception?
I would like to think not. I think that a number of the African Americans that I know are very much involved in job creation. I think that in particular African Americans come to the matter with a sensitivity towards affirmative action and a need to be inclusive and to empower Black South Africans. And so I think, for example, about American corporations sending people to South Africa. If you have a foreign corporation that is sending management to this country and it's a choice between African Americans or perhaps white Americans, I think that you will see that the African Americans who are involved in management are going to be much more biased in favor of hiring Black South Africans and creating jobs on behalf of Black South Africans.
Maki, there's a perception too that not all, but many African Americans tend to have an arrogance that make it impossible for Black South Africans and them to interact professionally or socially. Your views on that?
Okay. I mean, I want to start by saying, Felicia, I have no problem with my African American brothers and sisters being here. I think that they participated well in the struggle. I think that there's a unity that binds us beyond what we're made to believe at times. But I must admit, having lived in America, also studied there for 9 years, that there is a level of arrogance amongst African Americans in their country, but also here, of saying that we know it all. There's a tendency that they don't want to listen to South Africans and hear things from their perspective. It's an arrogance of Americans in general that is carried, yes, that is actually therefore transported here. And I'm not saying that all African Americans who are here or all African Americans who are in America are arrogant, okay? But I think that the majority of them who come and become visible display that level of arrogance. And the ones that certainly I have come into contact and worked with in South Africa definitely display that arrogance. They don't want to listen to any South African. They think that we are the backward as South Africans. Because you must understand also that also within the African American psyche, they have been sold by the white powers that be, that they are the best of the blacks internationally. Just as within the South African black community, the white community has told us that you see, you black South Africans are the best of the blacks, not of the Limpopo, are sort of the savages. And some of us have internalized it, and African Americans have internalized it. Okay.
Gabby, you studied overseas too. Did you find that when you came back from the United States, you were seen more as an American than a South African?
And I came during the days of Reverend Leon Sullivan's principles implementation. My particular view, and I have to make this comment, I think if there are any African Americans that need to be built monuments in this country, one of them is Reverend Leon Sullivan, in my view. I think Randall Robinson needs to be built a monument in this country. And there are several others that have played a very significant role. And to the extent that that is the case, and to the extent also that the South African media tended to demonize those kinds of people that were beating the drums for South African liberation, tended to get people like ourselves who were associated with the United States as troublesome characters from the establishment standpoint. Okay, so in a sense, what I'm trying to say here is I came here as some kind of an enigma because I was raised, I had gone to school in America. I was one of the first people that came back. So from the community, I think there was a role model exercise for me. But I think from the establishment standpoint, I was viewed as a character that was talking about black advancement, affirmative action, all kinds of imported kind of products coming to South Africa, coming out of the African American experience. So to that extent, yes, I think there's a fair amount of truth in the fact that I might have been viewed as a phenomenon.
Okay. Professor Cummings, you say from Du Bois to Dube. DDT Jabavu to Jesse Jackson, Martin Delaney to Martin Luther King. I think in short, you're trying to correlate the struggle there. NAACP to the ANC. Explain that.
Well, first of all, I'm very, very pleased to be here, but it seems to me that one almost always has to make analysis within the context of some reality. And one does not see what transpired in 1994, for example, as simply having occurred precisely because of those activities between 1970 and 1994. There has been a historical relationship between Africans, African Americans, ever since. In the case of South Africa, we've been very, very specific in that relationship because that particular relationship was most closely associated with our own environment and situation back in the United States. Which is why when I listened to that earlier comment about the effort on the parts of African Americans to somehow have some political influence or impact in South Africa, I think that's sort of a misnomer. I don't believe at all that most African Americans, upon arriving here, perceive their positions as to be involved overall in the political activities and the political goings-on. Rather, I think that one might pursue the analysis from the Chinese point of view. The Chinese, unlike others, have decided that economics is at the centerpiece of transformation. Now, we accept that politics perhaps controls everything, but economics in the final analysis does in fact control politics. So if you're going to empower a people in South Africa, elsewhere, it is imperative that those people first and foremost, even as they participate in the political arena, establish as quickly as they can some empowerment base in the areas of economics. So when one brings in, for example, IBM and other corporations bring in African Americans, what I've seen in my time here is that most often the African American does a very special thing in trying to bring to the front other South Africans who can then take over their positions. And I think that is important when we begin to talk about this relationship.
So are you saying that to some degree sometimes us as South Africans are impatient when an IBM brings in an American to hold that position for a while? We are seeing it as you're looking down on me, you are not really, you don't have faith in my expertise.
That may in fact be true, and I'm glad that South Africans are impatient. But I don't think that there are enough black South Africans who are presently prepared to train and help with other South Africans. There are not enough white South Africans to do a similar kind of thing. And I don't mean that we're bringing a wheelbarrow load of either money or other kinds of things, but what we do bring, and I think that is useful at this point in South Africa's development, is a commitment to the ideal that freedom is not free. That you do in fact have to pay for it. Someone pays for that freedom. And what that means is that one has to commit him or herself to several activities. One of those things is initiative. Another of those things is cooperation. And most importantly, a sense of a cause. And the cause here is the evolution, I think, of this South Africa into an economic arena that enlarges the base so that the entire population is empowered to participate in that base, both at the economic and the political level.
After the break, we continue to discuss the role African Americans and South Africans played in the liberation of this country.
There is a sense of xenophobia. I mean, we have to admit that. We do feel a little bit threatened because we are not yet there.
There's a thin line between gambling for fun and gambling as an obsession. Please, gamblers and their families, let's talk about this.
To continue from where Professor Cummings left off, in fact, the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of 1986 imposed economic sanctions against South Africa. This was followed by sanctions in Europe and Japan. The divestment movement, which was led by black Americans, forced universities and businesses to withdraw investment dollars from South Africa. From 1985 to 1991, the number of American companies with American operations in South Africa fell from 267 to 104. Ebony Magazine, August 1994. we talked to former Black Panther activist Stokely Carmichael, who is now known as Kwame Ture. Let's hear.
What role did African Americans play in the liberation struggle in South Africa?
Oh, they played a very crucial role. Of course, not only we're speaking particularly about the Africans in America, but Africans all over the world played a crucial role. But particularly in America, they played roles in boycotting products of companies which were invested here. They played roles in, they call the divestment divestment movement to take investments out. I remember as a young man in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the early 60s, picketing the then South African embassy in New York. And of course, I don't know if you remember in the later years, under the leadership, I think, of Trans-Africa and other organizations, there was a constant daily picket with arrest in front of the South African embassy with people like Stevie Wonder getting arrested, and this was continual on a daily basis. Of course, in other areas where you had representatives of your liberation movement like the ANC and the PAC, and later on ZAPU, demonstrations which were made against the racist colonial regime here, the settler regime, and many rallies and many rallies to politically educate the masses of people there as to their responsibility to stand solid with our brothers and sisters here in Azania, South Africa. So their role was a full role within the limits given the geographical distances.
Do you think South African blacks have forgotten that African Americans played a key role in the dismantling of apartheid?
I think the reactionary and the politically unconscious elements, now of course both of them work hand in hand. The reactionary elements wish to confine the thinking of Africans in South Africa to South Africa alone. Of course, it was not just Africans in America that played this role. If we would look properly at the decolonization process in Africa, the struggle here mobilized more Africans throughout the world than any other part of the struggle for the liberation of Africa, the anti-colonial struggle. So Africans all over the world played a crucial role. But when brothers and sisters in this part of the world call themselves South Africans and they think that South African belongs to them, they really cut across Pan-Africanism. Because if you think that only South Africa belongs to you, you think Lesotho doesn't belong to you. You think Botswana doesn't belong to you. You think that Libya doesn't belong to you. You think that Guinea, where I live, doesn't belong to you. You think that Ghana doesn't belong to you. And true Pan-Africanists know that every square inch of Africa belongs to every African. Therefore, if they think it's just South Africa that belongs to them, they leave out Egypt with all of a glorious history to combat racist garbage that says that we Africans made no contribution to humanity at all. So I think it's reactionary rubbish. Reactionary people use it to confine the thinking of brothers and sisters here, and it's anti-Pan-Africanist in the first order. So that our brothers and sisters here must know that South Africa doesn't belong to them. It belongs to all Africans, just like all Africa doesn't belong to others. It also belongs to them. Once this thinking is properly understood, then they will identify with the problems of all Africa. Therefore, the problems of Libya will become the problems of brothers and sisters born here. Just like Libya, during the struggle, played a key role in helping to liberate this continent. They gave financial support. They gave military training to armed cadres here that were carrying out struggle. And the worst crime one can commit in African culture is to be ungrateful.
I think some people are saying, I remember when I had the program on xenophobia, about us as South African being very xenophobic against our African brothers from other countries. And I can sense that again here where people are feeling, hey, just because they help does not mean that they have to come here and take over. Professor Mikey, I can see you guys are hot there already.
I want to take this debate a little bit differently. I think we're having a problem here. Nobody doubts the contribution of African Americans to the liberation of this country. Just like nobody doubts the contribution of liberal whites in the struggle in this country. We don't doubt the contribution of Nigerians in this country. But at the moment, we're trying to define new relationships. We have problems with liberals in this country. We have problems with Nigerians in this country. we're having problems with African Americans. And I think that's how we should approach the debate rather than go back and say,
Professor,
they did this.
What kind of problems are you having with African Americans? I want to take this up because, you mentioned, you said earlier that somehow we shouldn't be involved in the political life of South Africa. Let me just say this. If we had taken your position 20 years ago, there would have been no sanctions movement.
No.
All right? One other point. That's one more point. I went to Howard University, which is one of the largest and most esteemed black institutions of higher learning in the world. And at Howard University, we were taught from the day we got there until the day we left that we were part of a larger community of African people. Everybody, I don't care what your political persuasion. Wait, one second. And there were thousands of African students who attended school with us at Howard University. And no one ever said, well, you shouldn't be here, or you shouldn't be a part of our life. You shouldn't march with us. You shouldn't struggle with us. And they went down south with us to demonstrate and do the civil rights movement. No one ever said they shouldn't be there. It was a part of our life. We saw it as something that enhanced our being.
I accept what you're saying, and I think you have misunderstood me. The point I'm making is that we have all been in the struggle. What we are doing now is defining new roles for all of us within this new South Africa. I'm not saying that they didn't contribute, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be here, but we should understand the roles in which I think we're trying to define in the new South Africa for what I would call maybe African people outside South Africa. Just like, as I say, you cannot say, the liberal whites in this country did not contribute to the struggle and the liberation of this country. I think it's taken as a fact. But today, if you look at the tensions that exist within this society, we are trying to define those new roles, recognizing that they contributed, but now we are mapping a new future. And I think when it comes to African Americans, that is how we must approach it, defining new roles between people who have been an alliance in the evolution of a new South Africa.
I submitted this a little bit more than that.
The other thing is that, Felicia, I want to respond. To say that when American corporations here and they choose African Americans makes it kosher. I think that if one looks at the trends, not just in South Africa, but in the whole of Africa, and you look at the number of foreign expats, and I'm talking now foreign expats in the whole of independent Africa, you will find that Africa has much more foreign expats now after independence than before independence. And what has happened is that the skills of the local people have not been built. Whether you look at corporations, whether you look at NGOs, because what the government does, those organizations, whether it's Americans or German or German NGOs or American NGOs, they will say, we'll give you funding. But 80% of that goes back to them because they hire their own people in our soil. There is no transfer. They are not hiring our own people here in Africa or in South Africa. They're hiring their own people and the money goes back. And to argue that there isn't enough talent, I think, sometimes there's a scapegoat because there is enough talent here, black talent. There are lots of graduates who are roaming the streets who cannot find jobs in this country. So I want us, Felicia, to break the myth. And I think that the issue here is not that they are not welcome. As I said, I think that African Americans are welcome here. But they must fit in the society. They must not be a level above South Africans. And I think also, let me finish, please. And I think that, if you look at all what African Americans have said, they played a key role in the struggle through sanctions. Economic sanctions contributed. The people who played a key role in turning around these things are the children of Soweto and Katlego who died, who made this country ungovernable.
Tommy, let me hear you. You're quiet up there.
I think here we must be careful when we approach this thing. As you rightly pointed out earlier on, there is a disturbing degree of xenophobia that is taking place in this country. When Marcus Garvey was writing his works, he said they should come home. Now they have come home. Now, the fact of the matter is that do not blame the victims. The fact that some of these people are in senior jobs, it is not their fault. Blame the employers, the very people who put them in those positions. Now, let us be realistic about our current economic situation. Apartheid has denied African people the necessary skills right? And whether we like it or not, there is a there is a vacuum somewhere, somehow. Now, those who are outside, who are the Africans in the diaspora and the Africans on the African continent who relatively have been independent for a very long time, have the expertise and the necessary skills that can be utilized in this country, I will say for the economic development of this country, they are welcome to play that role.
Yes.
But would you say that the people who are upset or threatened are threatened because they do not want competition? Let me hear from you.
I do not believe, for example, that African Americans who are in the country are necessarily a threat to us, because we understand their history, we understand our own history. If you know where you come from, you know where you're going to. African Americans who are in the country here have come back home. We say welcome.
Yes.
I believe also that we should pay tribute to the late, the great Arthur Ashe, who spearheaded the athletes and artists against apartheid movement. And because he garnered a lot of support for a lot of people. But what I think is fundamental, and I want to take a leaf from Professor Makhuba's point, that there is a sense of xenophobia. I mean, we have to admit that. We do feel a little bit threatened because we are not yet there. We are still running the race. We still want to be economically strong as African people. We still want to get our land back.
Yes.
We still want our rights back.
Yes.
And this is very important. But our brothers and sisters from all over Africa, from the diaspora, as my brother has said, are helping us to liberate ourselves. And liberation and freedom, as Professor Cummings has said, is a responsibility. And our participation should be on all fronts.
Yeah, Felicia, I think I beg to try and put a different hue, I guess, on the issue. I think I'd take a number of points which have been raised by the professor, our visitor from Howard University, who talks about the importance, the socio-economic paradigm, how indeed a society that has been oppressed begins to develop, the importance of the economy. That's absolutely true. We do not deny that. I think that that is a intellectual, if you will, with due respect, an intellectual exercise. I could say the same things about Germans in their companies and how they create space for black South Africans, etc. It's a very intellectual exercise, and there I will not fault you. I think the issue here, the pain of the issue here, is precisely because there is such a historical bond between black South Africans and black Americans. We are, after all, Africans. That is the pain of the thing. The pain is that I've spent 15 years. I went to America going into a society, amongst a society, black Americans yearning, saying we want to go home. That is my premise. That's where I proceed from. And I am saying, I do, my brother, see black Americans as indeed our long-lost brothers who are coming home. And I want to embrace them in my home. And I want them to indeed begin to respect and understand and commit themselves to being with Africans as Africans on the African continent. The problem is that when I do not see that on the other side, I feel cheated. I say, but you are my brothers. We must live together and respect the culture. It's a cultural issue. It is not a necessarily socio-economic, intellectual issue. It's a cultural issue. I want the two of us to be together with mutual respect, dignity. I wish you to commit yourself to Africa. I find, and I agree with you, my brother, it's not all the same. I have many black American friends who have committed, who have made that divide. I was talking yesterday with a black American brother who lives in Deep Kloof. Deep Kloof. I respect that, my brother. I respect that. I respect that person. I respect that brother who says, I have truly come home. I am at one with my people. We will embrace you as such. However, if you come and cloister yourselves and separate yourselves and have a paternalism on the society, I get very angry. I think that's the issue.
But wait, Vuyo, in all fairness too, when we were living in the States, we also clustered with each other in one little community, and we never quite integrated.
A very good point, Felicia. Can I just say, because this is another part of the debate, it is the part of saying, how were we Africans accepted in America? The problem there, Felicia, which I was not able to elucidate upon, was that, yes, I was embraced as a phenomenon, as a black person from Africa. They themselves, the black Americans, were going through a struggle. I was not accepted into their society as a black African. They had problems about that Africanness themselves.
So maybe that is what Maki and Professor Mokhoba say.
Yeah, but Felicia, I mean,
precisely.
To support that, you know, I think that, look, I think that as African people, we accept the role Africans in the rest of Africa or in the diaspora played. That's not to deny that, and that there are ties that bind us, as Benamat Magubara has so eloquently written in his book. But let's not idealize the issue of Africanness and say that there are no differences.
That's it.
Okay? It's as simple as all of them. Let's hear you.
There's another important point which hasn't been raised here. I think
Your name is?
Emeka Wandeko. Another important point that hasn't been touched upon, and it's just bordering on it, and it's psychological. Now, in the eyes of the white man, I think the black man has been proven to fail in all accounts. He's been denied his own roots or his own rights in America. If you look at the rest of the African continent in terms of Nigeria, if you look at Uganda, well, Uganda is now solving its own problems, but look what's happening in Zimbabwe. They're all streaming to South Africa because at the end of the day, it's the last black hope. And there's this great pressure amongst, I'm a Nigerian myself, amongst African Americans, Nigerians, anybody else to say, look, this has to work, because if this fails, what do we say to ourselves? That's the issue. That's the issue.
Yeah, that's why I said here at the beginning that we are in a process of defining new relationships amongst ourselves, because we never had that.
Yeah, but
I mean,
I think you're spending too much time beginning to say, is this a carrot, is this an apple or not? At the end of the day, we want to do it.
Yeah.
Not a question of like saying, well, this is an apple, does this right fitting with our own agenda? No, not. You spend 5 years and it's gone. Mozambique spent about how many years doing some sort of development plan? It failed.
No.
People are here, they want to do something.
That's right. No, I think you're missing the point.
Felicia, can I just make a point here? In defining new relationships for African Americans, Nigerians, and other children of the black diaspora, I think I just want to take this debate to a level of economic activity and business activity. And when you look at the Anglo-Americans and the Anglo-Vols and all these large corporations, and you look at all the gains they have made, and you look at this and you examine the skills levels at top management, at technical level, you're going to find that whites don't have this discrimination that we're talking about. There will be Germans in there, Italians, Swedes, and all kinds of people. And to us sitting there, we say, oh, but this is really white competence. I think we have a challenge here today.
What causes it, though? What causes it that we should...
I think it's probably the mental enslavement that we have come through. But here is a point I want to bring up, the point for debate. And that is there no role, and I believe there is, for African Americans, for Nigerians, for Ghanaians, in bringing them into strengthening our own business creations?
That's what I'd like us to continue with after the break.
Yeah.
The tension that exists between African South Africans and African Americans is to do with the fact that they each have something that the other one wants very badly.
If you've donated or received an organ, please call us urgently.
I think when we went to break, we talked about how do we strengthen our expertise here in this country, regardless of where we come from. And I just wanted you, I'd like, Larry, you said that African Americans need to counter white flight.
Well, actually, there were several points I wanted to make, if you'll allow me. I agree with the professor when she said who should get credit are the children in Soweto. And actually, since apartheid isn't over, I think it's premature to start handing out accolades for who is responsible for ending it, for it has not ended. That's right. Back to the professor's point about... So we can acknowledge our respective roles, but no one should get accolades, awards, monuments, because it has not ended. The professor who said define our roles, I think that's important. But you know, if we recognize a common enemy, then that will define our roles, and it's not an academic process. Those of us who come over here, like myself, who have given up our first world standard of living, if you will, that is the commitment. That's the passion, my brother. That's the acknowledgement that we want to be here because we are here. And so that business role that we play, it's twofold. It's on the one hand, it's those managerial skills that we have concentrated on, but on the second hand, it is entrepreneurial skills, because that's the empowerment that the folks in Soweto need. They don't need to be part of a 30% stake in some large corporation. They need to be empowered and have 100% ownership in their own businesses. And it is that perspective, that culture, those entrepreneurial skills that folks like myself bring over here.
But then, Larry, people will ask, is it really being transferred? Is that being transferred? Sure. Give me some reality here.
Felicia, we have a problem in the States. Let me just say this. African Americans in the States have a problem with skills transfer. We have a serious caste problem in America, right within our own communities. People, the so-called bourgeoisie, reaching down to help the people in the ghettos. You know what I'm saying? So all I'm saying is that we don't have in our hip pocket the answer. Okay? All we can do is come and bring our experiences and try to learn and grow through the process. I'd rather be doing it here. I mean, that's just my particular choice, but I'm just saying that understand that African Americans do not have all the answers. They cannot make all the promises because we don't have it at home.
John, let me get a comment from you. John is the editor of The Independence, the Sunday Independence.
Yes, Felicia, thank you. Do I have to switch this on?
That's fine, it's on.
Just firstly to say
John, you mean you don't know how to use that thing? I thought you folk know how to use that thing.
No. I use a pen, Felicia. I don't know how to use this thing. Just to say, first of all, that I'm delighted that your program is taking forward the debate that we began in the Sunday Independence between Professor Makgoba and Charles Moses, because I think it's a particularly fascinating debate, and having worked during my career for American newspapers from South Africa, I became very interested in the whole question of the role of African Americans. What I've been thinking about sitting here is the whole question of our African Renaissance, about which much has been spoken and much has been written. And Professor Makgoba himself, I think, has had quite a bit to say about this. What is this African Renaissance? We know at one level it's about a revival and regeneration of Africa as a continent and a returning to the center stage of Africa. But my understanding of it is that it's much more than that. It's also about a state of mind. It's about a psychological revolution. Now, what bothers me about some of the tone of this debate, and I have to say some of what Professor Makgoba has had to say, surely this African Renaissance is for all black people. It's not just for South African black people. Yes, we are trying to redefine ourselves in South Africa, and I take that point. I don't think that African South Africans have a particular difficulty in redefining themselves. I think African South Africans have a very clear identity. The minorities in South Africa, like myself and others, we are still adjusting and coming to terms with finding a new overarching African identity in South Africa. But you see, I think there's something underlying this whole debate, Felicia, and I'm going out on a bit of a limb here, saying it as an outsider, let alone as a member of the white minority in South Africa, that in fact I think the tension that exists between African South Africans and African Americans is to do with the fact that they each have something that the other one wants very badly. That African South Africans very much want what they see of the success and the sophistication and the influence that African Americans have as African people in America. And African Americans desperately want the sense of identity and pride and knowing who we are in South Africa, who African people are in South Africa. I think that's really what's underlying it. And just a concluding point, if I may. I think the reason for the sense of frustration that is felt particularly by African Americans is that where African South Africans know that they're going to get what they're looking for eventually, because of the fact that they're in a majority in South Africa, African Americans are in a minority in America, whichever way you look at it. And they don't know how to get the kind of sense of identity and pride that black South Africans have. And that's why Nelson Mandela is an icon in the United States.
I feel fortunate in many ways, and maybe that's why I'm always criticized to a great extent by people, because I feel I have both. Let's end it on that note. We continue next week.
This emotional topic continues next week.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
We're never going to get the race thing right in America. We are 10-20% of the population. White folks are not going to give it up.
Professor, everything seems to be a problem for you. Why don't you tell us about the problems with the African American brothers and the white liberal brothers and all the other brothers? What is the problem?
Okay, let me tell you this. Africa, in my heart, is the absolute last frontier for blacks. Absolute last.
You gotta have a dream and make it work. What is your dream? This is your dream. Make it work. Make it work. It's right in your heart. It is a dream. This is your dream. Make it work.
If you've donated or received an organ, please call us urgently. There's a thin line between gambling for fun and gambling as an obsession. Please, gamblers and their families, let's talk about this. To contact The Felicia Show, call us on 011 880 1900 or write to us at FMS Productions, PO Box 29896, Melville 2109.